maybe you're not addicted. Maybe the problem is something far more unsettling. We live in a world that understands addiction as chemistry, as neurons misfiring, as a body that learned the wrong lesson and cannot unlearn it. That explanation is clean, manageable. It places the problem somewhere outside of who you are. But Carl Jung suspected something different. He believed that many compulsive behaviors are not driven by desire at all. Not by pleasure, not by the body's chemistry, but by something the mind is desperately trying not to see. And once you understand this difference, something disturbing begins to appear. What you call addiction may actually be escape. When we think about addiction, we imagine someone chasing pleasure, alcohol, dopamine, comfort. The image is familiar. A person who wants too much of something, who reached for something once, felt relief, and could not stop reaching. But Jung observed a different pattern in many people who came to him. They did not seem to be chasing pleasure at all. In fact, after the behavior ended, they often felt something else entirely. Not satisfaction, not guilt, not even regret. Something quieter than a strange hollow feeling, as if the thing they pursued was never truly what they wanted, as if the craving had been pointing somewhere else all along, and the behavior had simply intercepted it. Jung noticed that these people were not broken in the way medicine described. They were not missing something external. They were avoiding something internal. The behavior was not the destination. It was the detour, a temporary fog that settled over the mind just long enough to prevent a deeper confrontation, a confrontation with one's own inner life. And the mind, above almost anything else, will work very hard to avoid that. If you pay close attention to certain compulsive behaviors, you may begin to notice something curious. They rarely appear during moments of crisis. They appear during moments of quiet. Not when life is demanding too much of you, but when life, for a moment, is demanding nothing at all. A Sunday afternoon with no obligations. A long evening with nowhere to be. The specific silence that follows when everything has been done and nothing remains but yourself. In those moments, something begins to stir. Not danger. Something harder to name than questions that have never been asked. Desires that were never pursued, a life that was imagined once and then quietly set aside. And instead of turning toward these movements, instead of listening to what the psyche is trying to say, the mind does something very fast. It reaches for something, a screen, a substance, a habit so familiar it no longer feels like a choice. And in an instant, the quiet is gone. The inner voice that was about to say something important has been interrupted again, not because the behavior was irresistible, but because silence, for certain people, is the most unbearable thing there is. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries a hidden dimension of the self. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not simply what is dark about us. That would be too simple. The shadow is everything we have refused to acknowledge about who we are. Not only the impulses we are ashamed of, but also the ones we abandoned without ever understanding why. The creative life that was never lived. The courage that was felt once and then carefully buried. The anger that was swallowed so many times it became invisible. The desires that were real and were never permitted to be real. These things do not disappear when they are. They wait. And over time, they begin to press upward. They create pressure, a restlessness, a dissatisfaction, a vague sense that something is missing without being able to name it. Jung believed this pressure is what many people are actually trying to relieve. Not a chemical craving, not a physical need, but the unbearable accumulation of everything that has never been expressed. From the outside, it looks like a bad habit, a weakness, an addiction. But psychologically, something else is happening. The person is not trying to feel pleasure. They are trying not to feel themselves. And this leads to a question that most people will instinctively avoid. What would happen if the habit simply disappeared? If the distraction vanished tomorrow, not through willpower, not through discipline, but completely, permanently, without replacement? What would remain? For some people, the first honest answer to that question is terrifying, because without the escape, something would have to be faced. Not a memory, not a trauma. Something perhaps even harder than those. The unlived life. The version of yourself that existed as a possibility once and was never chosen. The path that was visible and then abandoned. The potential that was real and that may still be real. And that the mind has been carefully avoiding ever since. This is why certain behaviors resist every effort at change. Not because the body is enslaved to them, but because the silence they prevent is a silence that contains something enormous. Something the person has not yet decided whether they are willing to meet. Jung once suggested that psychological suffering often appears not when we have lost something, but when we have refused to become someone. So perhaps the question is not, why can't I stop? But something far more unsettling. What part of myself am I trying not to meet? Because sometimes the thing we call addiction is simply the mind's way of running from its own unfinished life.